Hello, class. This presentation is over Corridos and Calaveras. This is the PowerPoint that we were not able to go through today, January 28th, because we were having Zoom and technical difficulties. So if you were not in class because you're an online student and you were not able to get into Zoom, or if you were in class and you want to go through this PowerPoint, which we were not able to do so, this is a really great opportunity to expand upon the discussion that we had today. And for those of you that were not in class, really through no fault of your own, in class, we were not able to get any images up on the screen. So we just had a pretty informal discussion about corridos, about what they are, their importance in history, kind of the way they're built. And we talked a little bit about how corridos are they're poems, they're ballads, they're historical ballads, and they can be about all sorts of things, but a little bit about how the corridos are very much for the common folk. It was about getting information out that was not necessarily given out in any other form. You might want to think of today how you get your ideas out via Instagram or Facebook or even through your smartphone. The period that we're covering in With a Pistol in His Hand is the early 20th century, about 1915 or so. And this was a pretty violent period on the Texas-Mexico border. And in the first chapter of the Paredes book, With a Pistol in His Hand, we get to learn a little bit about the communities on the Texas-Mexican border. One thing that we talked about was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed on February 2nd, 1848, and which Paredes talks about just a little bit in his book. And basically, this is how a border culture was created. Because before this time, this landscape that we're talking about in With a Pistol in His Hand was was Mexico. And after the signing of the treaty, that same landscape that was Mexican soil once is now Texas. So you have a culture that is very much steeped in Mexican culture, but is slowly going to have to Americanize. And that's something that we'll talk about a little later. The corridos, let's remember, are representations of events. Maybe about heroes, maybe about religious themes, sometimes satirical about presidents or people in public offices. But they are composed by common people for common people, and they get disseminated on broadsides, which are pretty much like flyers that you might find at a market or at a bar or wherever people frequently kind of come together. So let's go through the PowerPoint, talk a little bit more about corridos, make sure that we're all on the same page. This next slide is basically just a definition of folklore. So folklore includes traditions and knowledge held by groups. It's passed down orally. Now let's remember, one thing that we talked about today, and this is one of the main points that we find in Paredes's With a Pistol in His Hand, is that Mexican culture before that is very different from Anglo culture. It is oral. It is not written in the same way that the histories that we get by the Anglos in the same period is written. So if you read Paredes carefully, you will see that he talks a lot about historians. For instance, the historian Walter Prescott Webb, who wrote many historical books on Texas. And what we see in his body of work is kind of a disparaging attitude towards Mexicans or Mexican Americans, and kind of a glorification or a mythologizing of Texas Rangers. And so another thing that we talked about today was the point of view of both of these kinds of groups of people. And they're very different, but they also have very different cultural backgrounds, especially in the way that information gets distributed and disseminated. So just to kind of go through this PowerPoint here, folklore includes stories, music, dance, legends, oral histories, proverbs, jokes, popular belief, customs even, of any particular population. And these are cultural forms. And the way that these forms get expressed is really important and something we're going to continue to talk about. So here we've got some more definitions. Very simply, at the simplest level, a corrido is a ballad, a poem that tells a story. It can also be called a narrative folk song. The origin is the verb in Spanish, correr, which means to run. And so a corrido is a running account of a story recited in plain verse. Corridos chronicle events, some important, some everyday or mundane. Some of these events include love affairs, gun battles, catastrophes, and the exploits of male, sometimes female heroes. And it's a very formulaic form. So at some point, we'll talk a little bit about the structure of a corrido. Corridos can have as many as 24 stanzas or as little as 4. Stanzas, of course, refer to a group of lines. In the corridos, these usually take the form of an A, B, C, B rhyme. And the form largely derives from the 18th century Spanish Romance. And in its most complete form, what we have are 3 parts to the corrido. A salutation from the singer and a prologue, and then the story itself, and then what's called a farewell or a despedida. And so here's an example of a broadside. Early corridos were placed on broadsides. These are one-sided, inexpensive sheets of paper. And a lot of times they're woodcuts. This one looks like a woodcut. And this one is definitely by the artist Juan Guadalupe Posada. If you've seen those skulls around the Day of the Dead, many of them hark back to Posada's work. And again, in the Tinker book, Corridos and Calaveras, you would have gotten some of that information. Some corridos, again, satirize public officials. They always speak, again, from the heart and soul of the common people, everyday people. Some corridos are really crude. You may have noticed in the Tinker book, maybe the one about the women or the one about the 41 homosexuals. Others are meant to celebrate victorious battles or heroes, like the one that we're going to look at in depth in With a Pistol in His Hand. And others highlight the fires of nationalism, and that's from Tinker. All, again, are folk art, everyday literature for the people with roots in Indo-Hispanic culture. And this is a broadside with Francisco Madero, who was president of Mexico from 1911 to 1913 until he was assassinated. So here we have an image of some early troubadours, and maybe some of you have taken medieval literature or done some other work, maybe in early British literature. But corridos are sung by singers, or not bards, because we're dealing with Mexican-American culture, cancioneros. Descendants of early troubadours is what corridos or cancioneros sing about. And the early troubadours really were extant in between the 11th and 13th century in Europe, mostly in France and Italy. Medieval bards usually traveled alone. They composed these lyric poems, right? Generally told in the first person and very emotional. And this is kind of different with the corrido. They're not usually first person accounts. They could be. Many of these were about courtly love or fabulous exploits of knights. These early songs, like corridos, were passed on by word of mouth. Again, the oral tradition is the important aspect of the corrido. And because it's part of an oral tradition, as we're going to see in With the Pistol in His Hand, we sometimes get different variants or different iterations of the same story. Here's a famous broadside. Again, broadsides are one-sided, inexpensive papers, sometimes woodcuts. This one depicts President Victoriano Huerta, who became president by a coup against the democratically elected Madero, who we just saw in an earlier broadside, and it depicts him as a spider. So again, the satirical, the sometimes tongue-in-cheek aspect of these corridos is something that makes studying corridos sometimes really fun. Huerta's reign began a very bloody time during the Mexican Revolution. And the Mexican Revolution lasted between 1910 and 1920. So when we're looking at the story of Americo Paredes, or I'm sorry, of that Americo Paredes tells in With the Pistol in His Hand, this is basically our time period. Some broadsides depict stories of saints or miracles, and these are called ejemplos, like examples. This woodcut depicts Our Lady of Guadalupe, who appeared to the peasant Juan Diego in 1531. This is a woodcut. This is a very famous woodcut, and some of you probably are noticing the little image of the Virgin Mary within that cactus, which has been serialized or repeated many times over. So maybe you've seen this image. Some corridos depict images of women soldiers, soldaderas, who fought in the Mexican Revolution. There were some women soldiers in the Mexican Revolution. Usually they had to dress up as men, which is probably not anything that is surprising to most of you. And a lot of these images, like this one, are really helpful in helping us, students of corridos or students of oral literature or even literature in general, understand how these images are very often full of pride, especially pride, this kind of resurgent pride in the nation after the Revolution of 1910. Images like this help us understand this idea of nationality and how the changes in a nation which are sometimes not necessarily imagined as being so important by those at the top, but how they are being disseminated, usually quite widely for the common people. So maybe those people, maybe those presidents, maybe those people in power do not know what is happening on the ground, but on the ground, things are changing. And because we're dealing with the time of revolution, there's a lot of changes going on at this time. If you're interested in a little bit more, right now there is an exhibition called The Skeletal World of José Guadalupe Posada, and it's at the Denver Museum. And again, this PowerPoint is in Blackboard, so you can click on this link and check out all the really, really cool images. If you like the calaveras, if you like all these candied skulls and all these images that tend to show up around All Souls Day or All Saints Day, which coincides with Halloween in the United States, check out the website. There's some really cool stuff there. Finally, for next week, let's think a little bit about a couple of things. And we did actually talk a little bit about some of this. Corridos most often detail the exploits of real people or events. They follow a form, a pattern, a structure, and they depict events as bigger than life or in a mythologizing way. And we talked a little bit about this mythologizing of stories. For instance, as we read chapter 1 of With a Pistol in His Hand, we begin to see how Anglo historians have somewhat mythologized the Texas Rangers, kind of made them bigger, better, more awesome than they really were. And there's a reason for that. We'll keep talking about mythologizing functions and myths and legends as we continue with the class. So to mythologize a thing is one way that we as humans explain events. Myths are deeply encoded sets of metaphors that contain lessons from history and essential elements of a culture's worldview. If you were in class today, we talked a little bit about creation myths. There are myths around even living people or maybe people that have died. We use the example in class of Elvis, who is kind of bigger than life, and some people don't think he's dead. Tupac Shakur, same thing. Myths are not falsehoods. They're not real. They help us explain events, sometimes events that are unexplainable, like creation myths, which we talked a little bit about. They tell us why things are the way they are and why we are the way we are sometimes. Myths sometimes compress or simplify, and again, idealize ideas. They help us give meaning to the world. So for next time, hopefully you've read through the Tinker book, and what I've asked you here is, did you read through any of the corridos in the Tinker book, and did you enjoy one or more than others, and why? And probably next time we'll talk a little bit about modern myth making. Do we have any modern myths? Again, we use the example of Tupac Shakur, who has been mythologized. But we're going to be dealing with the American West, and we're starting off with ideas surrounding Texas Rangers and Mexican Americans in a pretty hostile time period. So once again, as you continue to think about corridos, take a look at the corridos at the back of the Tinker book. See if there's one that you like. Once again, there is a analysis paper 1 handout in course resources that you might want to take a look at, because in that handout you can either write a little bit about corridos, and everybody's going to write a little bit about corridos, or maybe even create your own corrido depending on what you like. Thank you for listening. And again, those of you that were not able to join in on class today because our Zoom was not cooperating with me, please let me know if you'd like to chat, because we can certainly chat more about corridos. Thanks, class.